we've heard a lot about what's happening at the federal level. Well, as many of you know, the same challenge, the same struggle, same effort is being made across the country. And could I have that clicker? Thank you. So we have, I think, about a dozen states that have active efforts underway to initiate a price on carbon, particularly a tax. And what's really interesting is those vary dramatically from one state to another. What we have now learned, not surprisingly, is there's no one size fits all. And yet there are some common ingredients between what's happening in those states, from Washington to Massachusetts to Oregon to Pennsylvania to Maryland, right? There are lots of efforts happening, right? And they're being driven by a number of the same forces and coalitions that we see evolving at the federal level. So this panel is an opportunity to talk about that. And we have Marc Breslow, an economist who works with the Climate Action Business Alliance and Climate XChange in Massachusetts. That's where Marc's located. One of our sponsors, Michelle Romero from Green for All. McBroom from the Yes on 1631 in Washington State, which is on the ballot on November 6th. Camila Thorndike from Washington, D.C. area, who's worked on a recent initiative in D.C. that didn't work out, but we all learned a lot. And then Senator Mike Barrett from Massachusetts, who's been a climate pioneer now for, I think, 5 or 6 years. What we want to do in this panel is look at some of the strategies that are being used at the states, how you all can participate, and in those efforts in your own state. Part of the strategy and part of the thinking is if we move legislation at the state level, that may motivate federal legislation, because we're not really sure what's going to happen in Congress, right? We understand the complexities of getting, pushing something at the state level. It may prompt a pushback at the federal level. It may cause greater incentive to act, or it may not. So, Mo, let me start with you. In Washington State, this is, I think, your third go-round, right? Second on the ballot, right. And you've chosen, rather than through a legislative effort, which I know there have been a previous effort, to now go to the voters in November. And I also wanted to just acknowledge you, Senator Ranker here from Washington State. Good. So that the senator has been a major champion in the legislature, which is really, well,
you got us here.
We thank you for your effort. So Mo, what is the strategy to get voters to come out and approve this initiative this time around?
Okay, thanks. You stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to acknowledge that there's been a long path in Washington State and a lot of leadership from our elected officials, Senator Ranker being a central one, also our governor. But despite that amazing leadership, we've had some significant challenges. We have not been able to get a carbon pricing policy over the line, despite many, many years of action. I think I should have started by saying that when I'm not directly working on 1631, and actually even when I am, I'm with the Nature Conservancy. That is my affiliation. And the Nature Conservancy is a global organization which is pushing for action on climate, and we are agnostic with regard to what type of climate policy. There's many different climate policies, as other speakers have mentioned, that could work. And our challenge is getting something done. We believe action at the state level is a critical part of the path to the national and ultimately global solutions we're going to need to see. So we are focused on Washington. We are hoping to win in November, and we see this as a pivotal moment in the broader long-term conversation about national action on climate. So as we have taken this journey, despite huge efforts in our state legislature, we've not quite gotten there. And in 2016, there was a revenue-neutral carbon tax proposal which was on the ballot and which failed. And a lot of folks were worried that that was going to set us back. I am proud to say that, because of the dedication of many, our state has rallied now behind a new proposal, which has a real shot in November. It's fundamentally different in a few ways, and I'll talk about that with regard to its viability. A previous speaker said that we need policy that is effective, durable, and fair. I would agree with all of those things. I would add viable to that mix as well, especially when you're talking about a vote of the people. And for us, viability has to do with where we started and how we're moving forward on this journey. Rather than a bunch of environmentalists and economists kind of coming up with the perfect policy, we recognize that especially when you're talking about state action, we need to craft a policy that is specific to the particular communities, the business community, the rural communities, urban communities, in the place where that policy is going to land. So for the last 2.5 years in Washington State, we have hosted a very robust dialogue that has brought in voices that you don't often hear in the climate movement. Obviously, the economic impacts and the business impacts are front and very important here, and we've talked to a wide swath of the business community as we have developed a policy. But even more important from my perspective is working with those communities who ultimately are most impacted by climate change. So that means talking with tribal communities, talking with communities of color, recent immigrants, rural folks who are struggling financially, farm workers, the list goes on, but we need to bring those voices in, not just as folks who we bring into the coalition after the policy is baked, but at the very beginning, so that we know we're crafting a policy that works across the economic spectrum, across the political spectrum, and lands well in the communities that most need the help. Good. So after that dialogue, where we ended up in Washington is we have a package of investments that will ultimately cause major carbon emission reductions in our state. So this is an investment strategy. We call it a fee rather than a tax, because we're not putting a price on carbon simply to make carbon more expensive so people will turn away from it. We're thinking about how do we transition our economy fundamentally and invest in things and provide incentives to both families and to businesses to move away from more polluting technologies. In Washington, our policy package, 70% goes directly to carbon reduction, so that's like clean energy, that is energy efficiency, it's vehicle electrification. 30% goes to addressing the impacts of climate change that, as we were just discussing in an earlier panel, are already here. So how do we invest in forest fire risk reduction, water supply, flooding, and community safety? So this package does all that. It does it with a fee on carbon emissions levied on the largest emitters in our state. The fee starts at $15 a ton. It goes up $2 a year until we meet our state's carbon emission reduction goals, so it is performance-based. And then finally, there is also a regulatory a relief component. We would repeal an existing clean air rule at the state level. So it's not different in many ways from many of the policies that have been discussed earlier in the day. It is fundamentally different, I think, in the way the policy came about and what that means for who is supporting it, and hopefully that will help us get it across the finish line in November.
Okay. Yeah, just hang on to that just one second. So, I think two takeaways. One, who's involved in crafting the policy sounds like it's really important. And then the investment strategies in Washington. So, Michelle, if you would wait one moment. I wanted to ask Senator Barrett, so in Massachusetts, different scenario, right? So you've been at this for 5-6 legislative sessions now, have tried a number of different strategies, different than Washington State. And I remember one of the things that you said when we were talking recently was that because Massachusetts doesn't have a lot of old line polluting, traditionally carbon-intensive industries, it's more of a challenge. Well,
it's certainly a different conversation. But first of all, I want to tip my hat to Washington State. You guys are doing a terrific job. And I want to. Oh, you want it on too? Thank you very
Very demanding.
I was tipping my hat to Washington State for doing terrific work, and I want to temper the mood, or I should say I want to fool with the mood by being optimistic. Politically incorrect, maybe sometimes when we discuss this issue. 4 months ago, the Massachusetts State Senate, which includes 7 Republicans, voted unanimously on behalf of a carbon pricing scheme that gave the governor very tight deadlines, 24 months, to impose either cap and trade or a revenue positive tax or a revenue neutral fee. For us in Massachusetts, I have been working at this for 5 years, what really, we had a narrow majority, I think, anyway, but what really produced a unanimous vote and a bipartisan one is that we lifted the burden of choice from the legislators, not exactly a profile and courage observation, but there you have it, and gave them the option of being tough on deadlines but flexible with regard to tools. That turned out to be magical for us. So that does make me very optimistic. But here's the other thing that's changed in Massachusetts. The House, by the way, did not go along this time. Faced with this novel idea, they balked. The other thing I'm seeing, though, is a politicization of climate change in a way that hasn't been the case in the past. For 5 years, this has been the province of policy wonks and nerds. And you could speak to select audiences, but it was very hard to galvanize your typical voter who's got her mind or his mind on a lot of things. That has changed. In Massachusetts, and I can only speak to my own state, people are terrified about climate change. And what you've seen in Massachusetts is a kind of a dual radicalization. Voters on the Democratic side, especially women, have been radicalized by the presidency of Donald Trump. They are angry, they are agitated, they are working harder than ever before and overthrowing incumbents. It happened in our primary 1 month ago, who for some reason, I think rightly, are on the wrong side of that fence. The second instance of radicalization, though, does have to do with climate change. We don't have any deniers in Massachusetts, and folks who temporize on possible solutions are finding themselves on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of a near-term political dynamic. So we saw people go down specifically because climate change activists went door to door in their districts. I'm not supposing that the matter of dealing with a more conservative but heavily Democratic Massachusetts House is going to be an easy one, but I predict that because of Trump and because of climate, including these storms, you are going to see many incumbents, especially in our more moderate House of Representatives, threatened with primary races, which is where the real action is in blue state Massachusetts, specifically around climate and even more particularly around carbon pricing. So it is true, though, on the other hand, that every state's story is unique. Half the states in the United States have no extractive industries at all. We don't do coal. We have no oil. We have no natural gas. So for us, the idea of moving safely upstream, away from the attention span of the voter, in the hopes that she won't notice that we've raised the price of her fossil fuel, is less of a possibility. We've got to deal with people more or less directly and honestly. And I might say, as somebody who's interested in this issue precisely because I want the individual consumer to get, well, a market signal. I'm disquieted by the fact that the sales of SUVs and light trucks are way up, given the cheapness of gas, and the sales of fuel efficiency vehicles are way down. So it's not enough for me personally as a policymaker to see some middle person, some middleman absorb the price signal. I do want it to resonate with my voters. I want us to take those risks because that behavior, the consumer piece, has got to change if we're going to drive down emissions beyond electric power and actually be effective in the transportation sector. We've got to be willing to suppose that the individual behavior that changes is not, as I say, a corporate middle structure, but the consumer herself. I'm optimistic that we're going to get there because my constituents are increasingly terrified about the alternatives.
Good. Let me ask you, thank you for that description. And let me ask Camila to sort of piggyback on that, because in some sense, Washington, D.C.'s economy is, is certainly not a heavily industrialized economy. You have proposed a $10 per ton tax. So maybe give us a few details on that, but I'd also like you to describe, for the benefit of the audience, sort of the process of finding a champion, of recruiting allies, and what did not work and what you will do differently next time.
Great, yes. So these are moderately fresh wounds that I am sort of making sense of, but I've had the pleasure of working with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, or CCAN, in DC for the last couple of years, and before that helped start Our Climate, there you guys are, which is mobilizing young people across the country for carbon pricing. So I've worked in Oregon, sort of tangentially followed the Washington struggle, and now in DC and a number of other states, and I've seen a few key ingredients that various campaigns have nailed or not nailed, and now I think I've got my head wrapped around the ingredients that you have to have in place. And the first one you mentioned is a champion. If you're going to go a legislative route, unfortunately, we thought we were developing a champion in the DC Council, which really should be a state legislature, but Republicans in Congress will never allow us to be, or at least until things change. So yes, we need a 51st permanently pro-climate state. So the champion element is incredibly important, because in our case, there's only 13 lawmakers, and with a jurisdiction that voted 96% Democrat in the last election, it's really the primaries where you've got the only chance for accountability. And in our case, the lawmaker we were working with has been a real champion on environmental issues, but never felt that carbon pricing passion. And I can't imagine how you wouldn't feel that in the marrow of your bones, but that was the case. And unfortunately, she made public commitments that, yes, this is a great policy, yes, I'm going to get it done. And it's because we'd built so much political pressure. But then she chose at the very last minute, after rolling out carbon pricing kind of floaters that would have enacted a $100 per ton carbon tax on transportation and natural gas, and paired with a 100% renewable portfolio standard on electricity, and at the very last minute sort of ditched that carbon tax element and introduced just the RPS, with a number of other really bold measures, including a built-in energy performance standard and increasing a fee that is on dirty energy in the district, would equivalent $3 carbon tax would be the equivalent. So not a huge step forward, but you really, I think, have to have somebody who has that that commitment to the issue. But then you have to have the other ingredients, which I think we've seen states developing in terms of a coalition and the grassroots kind of groundswell. So in our case, we have 100 organizations really across all sectors in DC who rallied in a very cohesive way for this carbon fee rebate and investment strategy that we had developed with the help of a professional facilitator who really helped us bring stakeholders to the table, make sure that all voices were being heard, and that anybody who felt rebuffed in previous environmental campaigns or not brought to the table had every avenue for full participation. And at the end of that process, which I highly recommend having a professional facilitator help you in that, we had 100% consensus behind our policy approach, which was a $10 per ton per carbon tax, going up $10 every year to a cap of 150 in the end. And the majority funds going back in per capita rebates, with a portion for investments in equitable green investments, and then a small tax credit for businesses. So that was our policy, and we had the coalition, we had SEIU, Working Families Party, equity-oriented neighborhood organizations, all of the major environmental groups working in the area. We had dozens of small businesses, and really just this incredible excitement that was also aided by the third ingredient. I would say you do have to have the base. So to the senator's point, just to have constituents who are elevating this issue as a top priority. DC happens to have one of the most concentrated dots on the map in terms of climate alarm. And so we had this really sophisticated group of people who maybe are working on climate in their day jobs and then would turn out for rallies and lobby days. So the fifth, we've got coalition, base, champion, actually 6. I think you need these anchor organizations. So the large organizations like TNC or Green for All or others who are willing to see this idea through to the end alongside grassroots activists. And then the funders who are going to make that possible, because I think there's this expectation for a quick turnaround. And these are minimum 3-year, probably more like 6 to 10 year long efforts just to get the basic education out there. So there's a lot more I could say, but
Yeah, well, good.
that's my little book.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's circle back to that. Michelle, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. And Green for All has been thinking about these issues for a long time, about a just transition and about how communities that have been disproportionately impacted by carbon-intensive industries and hazardous waste sites have borne the brunt of the economic success. So when you think about just transition and you think about these 3 examples, what are some of the sort of non-negotiable points that Green for All and other environmental justice activists want to see embedded in any policy solution?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So, like you mentioned, Green for All is about how are we going to build a green economy for everyone. Green needs to be for all, not just for some. And so, one of the non-negotiables is nothing about us without us. And low-income communities and communities of color are hit first and worst by the pollution-based economy. You've got 68% of African Americans that live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. You have 80% of Latinos in the U.S. living in areas that do not even meet the Environmental Protection Agency's standards for air quality. These are big numbers. That's most of these communities. And so, when we talk about, and earlier you said, carbon pricing policy that's effective, durable, and fair, you can't do that without us at the table. And so making sure that the policies address the needs of these communities and that we aren't just reducing carbon emissions on a global scale, but that we are reducing carbon emissions on a local scale too, and not just, ending up with a more of an eco divide than we already have. And so a couple of other things, as you mentioned, Mo, getting that coalition together was key. I think it's key not just because it's the right thing to do, and I want to emphasize that. We're here to talk about the business case for a carbon tax, right? So it's not only the moral thing to do, it is the moral thing to do, but it isn't only the moral thing to do, right? Because of this process that the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, front and center, and so many groups in Washington worked through to design a policy that would do the least harm and the most good to these communities, we ended up with a fundamentally different policy. It still prices polluters for the cost of their pollution, right? Just holding people accountable. It's quite fair. It's not punitive. No one's trying to go and knock someone over the head for anything that isn't fair. It's just we're all paying the price of pollution today, and right now the burden of that cost is being put on struggling families' shoulders. And so it's just about making sure that polluters are accountable for their share of the damage that they're causing and shifting those funds into the communities that they've harmed. But it's good for durability, because right here in California, back in the day when we passed AB 32 and the state of California chose to pursue a carbon cap and trade system, you had oil and gas putting a ballot initiative on the ballot to basically tell low-income communities it's going to raise your gas prices, it's going to do all these bad things to your community, and you don't really benefit from it. And you know what? It was kind of true. And so while in the environmental community we sometimes look at these underserved communities as stakeholders that aren't really all that important to have at the front end because perhaps politically they don't seem powerful. Our opponents absolutely look at our communities as the very first place to go because you haven't talked to us, right? And so it's durable because it sort of ensures that, you know, the next year you aren't fighting the same battle over and over and over, and we can actually move forward to the next thing. But for business, I want to emphasize that, you know, the other thing that we think is non-negotiable is that we have to, as someone said earlier, I think it was the panel before us, they were saying there are so many climate policies, right? And a carbon tax is not going to solve the climate crisis alone. But it is perhaps the only solution that is on the table that has the potential to raise billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars if we all did it. And what we do with that revenue could literally be the difference between life and death, could literally be the difference between a thriving, clean economy that benefits everybody or a situation where we're all wiped off the map. And so dedicating a portion of these investments into clean energy, weatherizing homes, getting electric ride shares for rural communities to improve job opportunities, mobility access to healthcare in these communities, putting people to work and, you know, building the solar panels, working on the biofuels, all these kind of technologies can actually fight poverty and pollution at the same time and accelerate our transition. It'll grow green business. It'll help us get from just the early adopters who can afford the price of a Tesla or the price of solar panels to everybody being able to access the clean energy economy. And so that's good for everyone.
Great. Yeah, no, that is a helpful. That is a helpful analysis. Marc, let me turn to you as sort of, as a resident economist who thinks about trade-offs. No, not at all. No, that's a compliment. About these trade-offs, and I think we've seen in each of these examples, state by state, and also with Michelle's sort of broader perspective, that you can't do everything. You have to make choices, and that the design of any given policy, has certain economic impacts. So I know you've thought about how you design a policy and what its objectives are and what constituencies and outcomes are you trying to serve. So in your work nationally, what insights have you developed about that? Yeah, just push that up. Is it?
Someone will lend me their mic.
Sure, I think there's another one there. Is that working? Yes, okay.
So I think what we found is that in each state a different choice is being made. So even if we look at those of us up here, Senator Barrett's bill is 100% revenue neutral. The Washington, D.C. bill is what percentage? It's like 80 or 90% returned. Is that right? Okay. The Washington State bill is 100% investment and just transition, right? We also have a second bill in Massachusetts that's 80% rebate and 20% investment. The New York State bill is 70% investment, 30% rebate, approximately. So the political conditions and judgments are being made differently in each state, and I'm not sure there's any simple right answer. I think the one answer is that, in my opinion, that low and moderate income people need to be protected one way or another. And I feel at least that it should not only be low, it should also be moderate as a political judgment. And some other people in New York State, they're kind of, I think, making that not quite including moderate very much. You can do that in two different ways. One way is the fully dividend or rebate method, where you give enough money back that the rebate or dividend more than covers what you pay in. Another way to do it is to invest the money in things that help low and moderate income people do energy efficiency, do renewable energy, help them buy a more efficient car or an electric car. Those are two different ways of getting to the same thing, and there's differences of opinion as to how much money should go to that or whether you should do one or the other. In Massachusetts, we have tried to be agnostic on that because we have two bills, Senator Barrett's and a different one in the House, and we're supporting both, and they make slightly different judgments. And I think at least for our coalition, our decision is we'll support whichever one we can get in the end. But the equity component is essential, and a process in which, as Michelle said, the right organizations are included and have a voice in helping figure that out is important. I think Washington State and DC both had very extensive processes. I don't think we had quite as much of one in Massachusetts. And then I think you need to look at the numbers, and you need to look at a careful design of exactly how you do the dividends or how you do the investment, because either one you could do it in a way that wouldn't work out the way you want it to. And as an economist, I ran all these numbers in Massachusetts and tried a dozen different scenarios. And sorry, okay, I'll hand it back to you in a second. And tried to work out the numbers so that we could have the vast majority of lower income households come out ahead. It took some work in creating formulas to do that.
Hold on to that. I have this, but let me ask you. When I think back to some of the conversations last year around the idea of a federal carbon tax, there was the possibility of a trade-off. We impose a carbon tax and reduce the corporate income tax, or there might be some grand bargain in what became, the tax bill this year. But that didn't happen, obviously. But when you think about the trade-offs, is it possible that you could reduce one other tax for the carbon tax? And we saw that in Congressman Curbello's proposal, right? So he was essentially saying, let's do away with the gas tax and have a carbon tax, right? So is there a parallel there at the state level?
So, let me avoid the Congressman Curbello question,
okay.
If you'll permit me.
Sure.
But I think that this basic conclusion is that if you're going to cut a tax, it needs to be a tax that's at least as regressive as the carbon tax would be. All right? That's getting a little bit technical, but we know that a carbon fee or tax will take a larger percentage of money away from low-income people than higher income. If you cut a tax, say the income tax, the state income tax in most states, that's very little of that in most places is paid by lower income or even moderate income people. It's mostly paid by higher income. So lower income people are going to lose if you do that trade-off. What exactly the numbers are is different for every state. So in Massachusetts, because, say, the sales tax also turns out not to be a good trade-off because lower income people don't pay that much of the sales tax because we exempt food, clothing, and other things. In Washington State, because you don't have an income tax, right, the sales tax is carrying more of the burden, as are property taxes, and the numbers might work out better there, but I wouldn't know without actually examining them. So you have to look at the numbers in each state, and you've got to make sure that if you're raising carbon fees and lowering something else, that the right people are benefiting. And if that's not true, which has not been the case in the several states that I've worked on, then a rebate or a dividend that's flat or that even gives more money back to lower income than higher income is a better choice.
Mm-hmm. And Senator Barrett, when you hear that and you think about the objectives of your legislative efforts in Massachusetts, what are you trying to accomplish? You're trying to stimulate the economy, trying to reinvest money in green infrastructure?
Well, I should mention that Marc and I have been working closely on all these things for the entire 5 years, so we've kind of crunched the numbers and made policy decisions together in many cases. And one important thing to emphasize again is that everything is situationally specific. It's extraordinary as you get close to a given state how different it is even from its neighbors. So it is the case, for example, in Massachusetts, that the least regressive thing to do is strict revenue neutrality. If we collect money, energy consumption in Massachusetts scales up with income. You want to talk about another kind of unfairness. It's that people with more money get to spend more fossil fuel. They have the third car in the driveway. They have the summer place down on the Cape. So if we collect money, we're collecting it from people with a little more money on balance. If we then redistribute it per capita, flat rate, the lowest 60% of Massachusetts households in terms of income will get back more in rebate than they will have paid originally in the fee. So strict revenue neutrality turns out in that sense to hold not only poor families, but working class and middle income families. It holds them harmless, and that's critically important. That said, I think Massachusetts, and here's where the choices become very difficult for us. I'm just predicting that in the next 2 years, we're going to raise taxes in Massachusetts. We had hopes for a progressive income tax that our state Supreme Court dashed at the very last minute. I thought we were going to have a policy twofer in which we could distribute back all of a carbon fee, because that actually is the most progressive thing to do in terms of protecting poor people, but could raise money progressively using a progressive income tax. That twofer is now no longer a possibility. I think the legislature, and it does do this in Massachusetts every half dozen years, is going to have to raise taxes to fund our schools, which are also very regressively financed at the moment. When we have that tax debate, which would be a revenue positive debate by definition, we would give the state government money to spend. I want the carbon tax to be the preeminent choice. So since we're going to raise taxes anyway and get over that hump, which granted is a tough one for politicians, but we do get it over in blue Massachusetts, we get over that hump collectively. Since we're going to do it, the critical question is, can we position carbon pricing as the way to do it? I think the chances are very good that we can do that.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask, are there questions from the audience? If there are, I'm happy to take those cards, but in the meantime, Michelle, did you want to comment on that as far as how that would affect low-income communities?
Feel me on the edge of my seat?
I did, I felt that.
Yeah, I think the idea of just a dividend back to households, right, to say, well, if we do a carbon tax, then it might increase the price of gas on some households. It might increase, the cost for some low-income consumers, and so let's just give them a check back to kind of offset that amount. That's to offset the amount of the new harm based on the carbon tax. It does nothing for the harm that is already happening. And so, I think for a long time when we talk about equality or we talk about equity and the civil rights community, it's our fault. Like, the civil rights community has done such a good job at the do no harm message and playing defense, right? Please don't do any more bad stuff to us, that we haven't yet really shifted to actually we need to really do a lot of positive, proactive, good stuff. We need to do a lot of positive, proactive investing in these communities to bring them just up to where everyone else is. And so I love that you're thinking about, how do you use these revenues, even if it's to invest in solarizing your schools and, getting the school buses to convert to clean energy or electric buses, right? Starting with your lowest income districts. I mean, the cost, when we think about the cost, we have to think about it holistically. And how much is it really going to help a family who might get a couple $100 later or even $1,000? I mean, if they catch up that month, the next month they're still struggling. Yeah. And so instead, if we can reduce the cost and stop paying so much in taxes for cleanup after, these hurricanes and wildfires and all of these kinds of things, stop paying so much into a healthcare system because people are being sick from the pollution, and actually invest in solutions that get us ahead of that and into a new, clean future.
Mo, there's a question or two about what people in this room can do to help pass this ballot initiative with all its great provisions.
I thought you would never ask. Thank you. There's a lot. I mean, there's huge business benefit to Initiative 1631, and I think you all probably know what that is. One, it's regulatory certainty. It's having the carbon price on the books, knowing that's the approach, takes away the sort of Damocles with regard to future regulatory approaches. Number two, it invests in incredible, clean energy transition projects that will create jobs and will be a huge boon to the business community in our state. And finally, it invests in things to address some of those major challenges that our business community faces with regard to the uncertainty of environmental impacts, whether it is the wildfire risk, whether it is flooding that's shutting down I-5, or other impacts. Our challenge in Washington, to be blunt with this audience, is that the business community, with a few exceptions, has mostly engaged to look at policies over the years to just make sure it was okay and it didn't hurt them. And once that was clear, then they stepped back. And what we need from the business community to get good policy over the finish line is engagement in a very proactive way with your brands, with your dollars, and visibly say, this policy is good for us, and hence it tells the public it will be good for you as well. And so I can call out some amazing businesses. We're about to make a big announcement in Washington, so I can't I can't out people yet, but REI is a huge one that has stepped forward and said 1631 is good for us. For any of you out there who have that opportunity with your business, with your brand, be a voice for vocal engagement. We need you on our endorser list, and we need you engaged.
Customers are looking for that now.
And so thank you. And we have time for this last question. And Marc, I think I'm going to ask you this, and this is something kind of near and dear to my heart, is how do you message this idea of a carbon tax or carbon pricing, right? So in our community, in our ecosystem of advocates, we use different language. Sometimes we don't want to use the word tax, right? Because it has bad connotations. We heard it was a 4-letter word. Price means a bunch of different things to different interest groups. So what is your recommendation, having worked in a number of states?
We keep hoping that we can get people to use price or fee and not use tax. And we keep trying to do that. I'm not sure we'll ever win that battle, but I think the messaging somewhat should focus on other words. For example, I've now taken, whenever I can remember to do so, to always say carbon pollution pricing. All right,
carbon
pollution pricing. That people don't know what carbon pricing is. It could be like what you want to raise the cost of pencils. So, people just don't know what that means. They know what pollution is. So that's one part of the messaging, is that we're trying to reduce pollution, and that's both globally and locally.
Good, okay. Well, we're going to have to call it good there, but I do want to encourage all of you who are thinking a lot about national policy to also dip in and see what's happening in your own state. These are parallel paths, and I think are important. Thank you all, and why don't we have the next